In that case, I unbolded them. So Control G, special. Whenever I make a mistake or people make mistakes, I say, well, that's an option to learn or practice, right? Doing it twice, there you go, you'll remember it. Okay, now I want a formula to add up all these numbers. Now, the wrong way, or the really tedious way, would be to go equal this cell plus this cell plus this cell plus this cell, whoops, plus this cell. That works, gives me an answer, but it's not the right way, or the easy way. So the better way when you want to sum a bunch of numbers is using the sum button. Now the sum button in Excel looks like it's a Greek symbol for summation. So that's that weird button there. So if you happen to be underneath the numbers, and I usually skip a row, but just so keeps it segregated from the data, if you hit the sum button, it makes an assumption that you want to sum the numbers above. Now, if there was any gaps in there, like a blank cell, then it would stop prematurely. So you'd have to manage it by highlighting the cells that you want to select. So that is a very useful skill, but I want you to know how to do it when it's not underneath. Now, if you have a bunch of numbers horizontal, the sum button works horizontally as well. Like if I had a number there and I hit sum, it makes the assumption that you want to sum the numbers to the left. Again, it will stop prematurely if there's a blank column, a gap in the data set. So that's not what I want you to do, but that's good to know those two methods. What I want you to do is sum those numbers and the answer in this cell. So again, I hit the sum button. It doesn't know really what I want to sum. It's not smart, right? So it jumped up, it looked above. So all I have to do is highlight the cells now that I wanted to sum, and then hit enter. And that's summing all those numbers. So as these numbers change, of course, the sum changes. Now, what's really cool is I think of the sum function. That's what that's called, a function type of formula, built-in function that does specific type of math or statistics. The beauty of the sum function, or many functions like this one, is that it's like bookends. So it's summing from B14, that's that first cell, to B18, to that last cell. So I'll highlight this and make it yellow just so you see what's going on. If I insert a row by either right-click insert or Control plus, when you Control plus or Control minus would delete a row, good keyboard shortcuts. So if I add a number in there, the sum still works because I inserted in between those two, the first and the last bookend cell. That's why the reference is kind of nice. You can easily insert data within that range, and your formula is smart to update. That's one reason why I mentioned earlier that I always stress if you're going to have a sum function underneath numbers like this, always have an empty cell. I call that the bookend. So the beauty of having an empty cell, usually I'd even format it, maybe make it look a little different, like that. So my data is that, and my bookend is there. So that I know that this is summing from this cell to this cell. So if I want to add something underneath this number 2, I know the bookend it's including the yellow. So I just need to insert by selecting that bookend row and Control plus or right-click insert, and I can add more rows, and those numbers will be included in that range, that reference. Now, of course, this formula wasn't smart enough to know what I was doing, so of course it's not changing that. It's just still looking at this range. So sums underneath usually are better with bookend rows. So as your data grows or shrinks, your formulas are smart. What I should mention real briefly is there's 5 really common functions that are used that are very similar to the sum function. I should make that bold. So there's sum is one of my favorites, use a lot. There's also max, min, average, and count, and a few others, but those are very common ones. So if I want to change this from a sum to a max, I just double click on the word sum in the formula, Double click is word select, or range select in this case. And I change it to max, and now that's the maximum value. And as the number goes in, it's always showing me the maximum value. So same thing, I can change the word max to average, AVG. Now, AVG doesn't work in Excel. You have to use the full word average. And it was smart enough to know that, so it substituted the word average for me. So certain functions are very fussy. You have to spell it the way the function wants to be written. Now there is a function wizard in Excel to help guide you through the list of functions, and that will come later in more advanced training, because I prefer that you learn the functions that are most critical, being able to type them rather than picking it from a huge list of all the functions in Excel. And you notice as I start typing, it automatically starts looking in the list of all the functions that start with that letter. So if I'm doing count, C-O, see there's all sorts of interesting functions there. C-O-U-N. So there's count A, count blanks, count ifs, all sorts of count functions. So you can then double click on the one you want. And when I hit enter, that counted how many cells this thing is looking at. So that's fun with functions. Let's go back to now some easier ones. This is just a simple formula to multiply those two cells. So that's equal click times, which is star, click, or the asterisk they call it. And that's the answer to that cell. Now, as you're going through this video, anytime you want to try something, just hit pause. The space bar will pause the video, so you don't have to grab your mouse and click on the little pause button on the video, and the space bar will start the video again. So if you're running two screens, that's awesome, because you can have the video on one screen and then your Excel spreadsheet on another, and then practice what you're learning as you're learning it. Now this next challenge is basically just I want to make sure that people know that when you have a cell that contains more text than can fit in that cell, it overlaps the other cells. So people might think, oh, I want to edit the word school because I want to change it to the proper spelling. They might think it's in this cell. It's not. It's just overlapping that cell. When I click on that cell, you see it's blank in the actual content of the cell. It shows blank. And if I type something there, now it's underlapping that cell. So it looks like it's cut off, but it's actually going underneath. So it's cutting, the data still lives in cell A28, that sentence still in there. So as soon as I remove this thing I type, you see the full sentence. So you could widen this column with the junction of A and B, widen that so it shows the whole thing. But sometimes that's not necessary, because you can read it, you can see it, you can print it. So why? It doesn't need to be widened, because that makes everything else look weird. Now there's also auto size. If you're at the junction between two columns where you can manually size a column, you can double click there and it auto sizes to the largest text in that entire column. So auto size works on one column or multiple columns. Now, if you wanted to bring it back, say it auto size really crazy, like way off your screen, Control Z will bring it back. Now, some people do merging, the merging cells, merge and center. I avoid that like the plague, because it creates problems with data lists. So as just a standard habit I have, I try to avoid merging and centering if I can. So when I edit that text, I can edit by double clicking in the cell that the text lives in and then edit up here, or you can go directly to that. You select the cell that the text lives in and you can edit directly in the formula bar. So all I have to do is click in the word school and add the O and then hit enter. So that's the easy way. So either double click and then edit, or because you can edit down here too. If you double click, you're in edit mode within the actual spreadsheet. You can edit. So if you ever get stuck in double click, remember I mentioned earlier, just hit the escape key. Okay, this next exercise is just so that you know how you can copy cells. So it speeds up time. You don't have to type the same thing many times. So if I want to copy this number in all these cells, one cheat is you can use the copy corner, copy it all the way there and down, right? And then it's done. But it doesn't look as good because, so I'm just doing Control Z. I don't want it in those cells. So I want to copy that cell. So I select it, go Control C, and then highlight the destination cells and Control V. So Control C to copy, Control V like Victor to paste. And if you want to move something, like I mentioned earlier, how you can move something by going on the border of the cells and move it, but you can also do Control X and then Control V to cut and paste. So the bottom keyboard shortcuts, the most important, are Z, X, C, and V. Now, the idea of copying, I mentioned earlier about how you can copy cells down by the little copy corner. So you can copy cells across. In this case, I want to copy the word Monday across. And watch what happens when I copy it across. It cycles, and it shows you what it's going to put in that last cell. So I want to go all the way to Sunday, right to there. When I let go, that's where it's going to end on Sunday. So it automatically makes an assumption based on what words are in the cell. So if I had MON in there, it would put in the short form of the day of the week. And if, of course, if I had Jan or January and a copy across, it'll go like that. So it makes assumptions based on what it sees. And there's, like, even for like accountants like this one, because they're typing that a lot. But almost anything with a word number combination, like if you're selling TVs, automatically it should cycle. Now, if it cycles and you didn't want it to cycle, then just hold down the Control key and you're disabling that. It basically reverses the way Excel behaves. So if it's cycling and you didn't want it to cycle, hold Control. If it's not cycling and you want it to cycle, hold the Control. So you can play with that with the Control key. Either do it with just the mouse or hold down the Control key and then try to copy. So that's what that example is, to show that different ways of copying data across. And this one is just copying the same concept, but just copying it down. So I just want it to December, so I'd stop at December. If you go too far and you let go, you can just back it up like that, instead of having to undo and redo everything. But if there was data down there and you accidentally went too far, you've removed that data. And if it was important data, you'd have to do Control Z and do it again. So if you ever accidentally move something, don't move it back. That's a problem with so many people with spreadsheets, because if it was a formula, formulas will change in a relative way, and sometimes you mess up a formula by moving it. So if you move something and you say, oops, I didn't want to do that, remember, every time you think an oops, Control Z. And let Excel put things back the way they were. You can go back through history with Control Z, right? And go back to many, many steps. And before you do something really complicated, you want to save your work so that if you mess something up, you can go back. And saving multiple copies of a file or having a revision history is very useful too. So that's what that is. Now, if you had data, this is really cool. If you had data next to this, right? Instead of copying this down manually, that's what most people do. If you double click on the copy corner, Excel makes the assumption that you want to copy it down to the last row it has data. So if you have a spreadsheet with like 200 rows, it's a huge time saver, because a lot of people complain about Excel. They say, or spreadsheets in general, they say when they're using the copy corner and they're copying for many, many rows, it's very tedious, and the numbers scroll really fast, and they go, oh, and they accidentally copy over data, and they go, oh, shoot, Control Z. But if you just double click, no matter how long the data list is, as long as there's no gaps, there it'll copy down the data. I'll show you what happens if there's a gap. Imagine if that gap was 3 pages down, you wouldn't notice, unless you scroll down to see that. So you have to be careful with the copy corner double clicking. But it is sure time saver. So that's a few things about using the copy corner. In this example is just a review of what I mentioned earlier about when you want a series of numbers. Now there's a way in the formula bar, in the toolbars to actually do to create a series of numbers. But the easiest way is you put your first value that you want and your next value in the sequence, say 10.23, highlight those 2 cells and then copy it down. Now the most efficient way of doing that would be, before you type, is highlight the 2 cells. When you type the first one, remember I mentioned about data entry with a selected cell range, it keeps you in that range. When you hit enter, it automatically takes you to the next cell. And I type 10.23. I don't even have to hit enter, I can copy that down right away. And I get what I want. Just a little bit more efficient. And that's the answer to that test question. This one here is to basically try to enforce a concept of range names. Now I've already named this list of numbers the word grades. I'll show you it's in my list here, grades. So by selecting it from there, it automatically highlights it. That's pretty powerful. If I want to, do data entry, I just have to go to my grades and then type my new grades. But the other beauty is that you can write formulas in an easier way. So if I wanted to know, I wanted the average of those grades, I can just type the formula equals AVG. Now it's going to substitute average. I just don't like to type it. Average of grades. And you notice as I type GR, it brings me a function, but it also shows me all the range names starting with GR. It's right there. So I don't even have to type the full word. Just double click on that. Now, I get lazy. I just hit enter, but you're supposed to close the brackets. But watch what happens. If you don't close the bracket for the function, Excel will do 2 things. It'll fix the formula to be the word average, and it will also close the brackets for me. So just a habit I have is I don't close my brackets. I let Excel do it for me. So now the really cool thing is I call recycling formulas. For the best grade, that's max, right? So I can copy this formula, Control C, and paste it here and here. Now I just held down the Control key and selected both cells. So when I paste, of course, I'm gonna get the same answer. But watch this, I can double click on the word average and change it to max. And in this cell, double click on the word average, change it to min. So now I know my average, what is the best grade? What was the lowest grade? Recycling formulas, very, very useful. Now, if I want to count how many students did the test, I would just copy that formula down and change that to count. And there's standard deviation, there's a whole bunch of other things. So very powerful, easy to type formulas once you know the basic, most important ones. And in the formula ribbon in Excel, there is function wizard. This will list all the functions, and it has a whole bunch of other things, but that's beyond the scope of this course. Like I mentioned, it sort of starts listing them as you start typing, but this will list all of them. If you want to see just the most recent ones, or you want to see all of them, financial. So there's a whole bunch of functions in Excel. I have a spreadsheet I share with advanced users of Excel of all the functions that I use a lot and examples of how they're used. So if you want a copy of that, I can send that to you. You can send me a request. Okay, so this last little exercise is the most complicated one. It combines a whole bunch of things, so like the idea of range names and writing formulas and using the sum function, which is on the home ribbon. Okay, so the first thing is I named these cells, these rates. Almost any time I see rates on a spreadsheet, I expect that they have a name. They have some sort of name. Now, the easiest way to name a cell is you highlight the label and the value, and you can go to formulas, create from selection. So that'll create range names based on the selected region that you've got highlighted, and made the assumption that the names or labels are in the top row, and that assumption is correct. Sometimes it makes bad assumptions, and I have to say, no, they're in the left or whatever. So you can make sure that's correct. When you hit OK, now this cell has the name prov. This cell has the name fed. Now, the beauty of that, it's a locked reference. In more advanced training, people learn about what's called locking references, locking columns, locking rows in formulas. And if you range name a cell, that locks it in a very nice way. So I want to calculate the CPP on this guy. His gross salary is $25,000. So these are little graphic circles. If you click on them, they're floating above the spreadsheet data. So you'd have to make sure you don't click on it or move it away or delete it. But if I click on the side, I can select the cell. Because I want this cell to be equal to 2% of this number. So I simply type equal, and I click on that cell, and you notice it types CPP and times this cell. And so that's the answer. So I can copy that down and just validate that it's the same, see, it's the same reference, CPP, CPP. Instead of it referencing that cell as a C103, that's its address, that would have changed if I would have referred to it as by its address. As I copied the formula down, the formula changed in a relative way, right? Because it went to B104, B105, B106, which I wanted that to change. I wanted the reference of the person's salary to change as I copied the formula down, but I didn't want that reference to change, the reference to the CPP rate. So that worked really well. Now the same thing I want for these cells, it's almost exactly the same, except this one I wanted to reference UI, prov, fed, and so on. So instead of having to do the click times click, well, actually it's probably better to do that. So I go equal this cell times this cell. Now, if I wanted to be able to copy this formula across, I would have to lock the reference to the column B for where the gross salary is. So then I can lock one thing and not the other. That's basically the $sign that does that. So I'm locking the B reference. If I want to lock the row reference, I would have to put a $1 in front of that too. So the $sign here doesn't mean money, it means lock. So I'm saying lock the reference to the column B in that formula. So now when I copy that down, that doesn't change, of course, but when I copy it across, see, it's exactly the same formula. I just have to change the reference to UI. Now I can copy that down. So that's UI, that's UI. But you see the reference to the B cell, B column, the gross salary, has stayed the same. Now, I could have done is I could have named these cells gross salary and seen what that would do. But anyway, that's for another course. I want to do the same for provs and fed. So I can just copy that across. Oop, delete those little circles. I don't like them. They're getting in my way. Move them away. Oh, there's many of them. So when I copied across, it copied the circle across too. Okay, so I want this one to be prov. Now watch when I type just the letter P in there. See, it brings up all that stuff, all the functions that start. Eventually, it's going to show me prov right there. So that is the provincial. This one, I want it to be the fed. And sometimes it's easier just to, oop, it didn't like that because the fed has a dot in it. So I don't like field names like this to have dots in them. So I would, because it allows that mistake to happen. Okay, so that's now these are all formulas, so I should probably make them bold. Practice what I preach. And there's my spreadsheet. Now I want to put the net salary. The net salary is this minus the sum of all those. So that's a fancy formula a bit. This one's an easy one. I just want to sum the salaries. This formula here is really easy. All I have to do for this one is use the auto sum, right? It's just summing those three numbers. And that same concept works for all these columns, so I can just copy that across. And I'll copy it right to there. Now, I copied it to here, even though these don't exist yet, because it's just ready and waiting. Now, instead of creating a sum and copying across, another way I could have done it, which is actually more efficient, is you highlight the whole cluster and auto sum, and it puts the sums appropriately under each column to where you had the blank row. Now, to improve the spreadsheet, I should have a bookend row, right? Because I might, I'm going to remove these little floaty things from the quiz so you don't have the same problem I'm having to delete the ones that I've copied over. So these formulas now are no good, right? Because I want to include that bookend row. So now when I over select to where I want the answers and I hit auto sum, boink, I get my answers, but they are including this bookend row, row 107. And if you don't like bookend rows to be so chunky, you can make them skinnier. You can even make them almost invisible, but I like people to see them because that's the row you'd select if you want to insert at the bottom of your list, right? You can select that row and insert a new row and add a new person, and their salary will be part of the soup. I just need to copy these formulas down to fill the gaps. Now the net salary one. This is the challenging formula. This is, if you can do this, you're pretty advanced. It's basically saying, take this number, subtract all these taxes, all these charges or whatever. So I know I'm going to be summing this, but I'm going to just write it the way I said it. So I'm going to say equal. I want to say equal this cell minus, and then you need to put it in brackets because you want to have, you know, the BEDMAS rules, bracket, exponents, division, multiplication, addition, subtraction. So I want the sum to be done. If I was going to add these, I would have to do them one by click by click by click. You'd have to use brackets. In this case, I'm just going to type sum of these cells. And now I need two brackets, right? I need one to close for the function, the sum function, and another bracket to close for what I want to subtract this chunk, right, to close that bracket. Now, if I didn't remember my brackets at the end and I hit enter, Excel is going to finish it for me. Oh, it says VG, very good. That's just a function that's saying if I get the right answer, it's going to give me some feedback. So that's a good formula, right? It's saying take this number, that's your gross salary, and subtract the sum of those cells. Now, if you're thinking you're going to be adding more taxes, hopefully not, but you would also have a blank column as your bookend column, but we're not going to add more taxes ever. So I'm going to just copy that down to there. Now this, oh, I didn't have this function copied over here. So that's my total net salary payout. That's not right. Oh yeah, 17,000. So his gross was 25 and his net is 17. Yeah, that's way too much taxes. So that's feds, we're gonna remove the Fed tax. Let's drop that down to say 3%. That's more realistic. Provincial, and we see how it's working. Everything's dynamic. based on these formulas. So if this made some sense to you, then you're in the fast lane. It takes practice getting to the point where this is really becomes like just natural, that you can just write formulas out of your head. So I'm going to step it back a bit and we'll go into some basic concepts that will be on the quiz.